This is Coffee with Kelly, a dynamic podcast that's dedicated to driving positive change in school safety. I'm your host, Ethan Woodman, Product Marketing Specialist for Crisis Go, and I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Kelly Moore, Senior School Safety Specialist for Crisis Go. Our mission is to empower you with essential knowledge, tools, and inspiration required to foster a safer and more secure school environment. We hope this podcast will be the catalyst for transformation in your schools. Join us as we continue to dive into the world of school safety. All right. Good morning, Kelly, and good morning, Sarah.
Hi, good morning.
How are you guys doing today?
So good.
Fantastic.
Beautiful sunshiny day.
And where are you located, Sarah?
I'm in Pennington, New Jersey, which is near Princeton University.
All right, it's just like in between you and me, Kelly. Almost.
Very
Almost
close to my
distance.
daughter. About an
That's
hour
true.
away from my daughter.
Yeah. I feel like we should move Sarah, like her little tile in between us, and make more sense. No. All right. So Sarah, I will let you introduce yourself. Tell us what you're about and why you're here.
Yeah. I am a former high school English teacher. I taught English for about 8 years here in Jersey, and I did love my job. Many things led me to where I am right now, but I currently work in market development for a company called National Safety Shelter. So I am still in the education world, but I'm on the safety side of it.
Nice. All right. So I know it's really interesting because I know I've been to a couple conferences where we've seen some similar things that, sometimes Kelly has his reservations about. So I was generally surprised when
sometimes I flat out against them because they make no sense, right?
Yeah, I was being nice, but
yeah, I do understand the reservations you have because I share some of the same sentiments, particularly about the electronic fold out versions. Actually, on our blog, we recently posted a just sort of fact checking pros and cons of fold out versus fold out shelters versus a fixed permanent structure.
So before we move on, I do want you to tell your story of why you are no longer a
educator.
Yeah.
A high school teacher. Yeah.
Yeah. So we had an incident. I'm not going to say the school, but we had an incident at the high school level. So I was on a library duty. So I was, in our media center, and I don't know if the media centers typically lock or not because they're usually like a set of double doors. Ours, I definitely did not have any sort of key, and maybe they lock, maybe the maintenance person has a key for end of day stuff, but definitely I knew I was not going to be able to lock the library. And pretty suddenly, it was a very traumatizing event for me. This is something that has stuck with me forever, and as a parent has influenced me pretty permanently. So and just for any bated breath situation, everybody ended up being okay, but this was just one of those close call situations that impacted me. So I was in the media center doing normal things. There were maybe 2 other kids in the media center, and typically there would be 2 people there, but I happened to be the only person there at the time, manning the front desk. And I heard in the hallway that the media center is in, which came at a point of 2 hallways. I could hear a very distinct screaming of terror. And anybody who works in a high school knows that there's yelling in the hallway. Sometimes there's maybe even high pitched screaming of, maybe one girl is so excited to see another girl or it's her birthday or someone did a promposal. There's oftentimes a lot of noise, but it was a very distinct type of noise, and all the other noise immediately stopped. So it was something that I knew right away. I knew right away that there was something major happening in the hallway. And my first assumption was that somebody had a gun, and I was correct. And so within seconds, there was a lockdown, not drill, but a lockdown called over the loudspeaker. Was our principal's voice, and usually it's not the principal that says, "Oh, we're going into a lockdown," which is typically a drill or something very minor, like someone's having heart palpitations, so an ambulance came, so we're going to go into a lockdown or a shelter in place because there's an ambulance in front of the school. This was a scenario where It was very real. And so I knew I could not lock the doors. I saw 2 kids. I was also really panicked because I wasn't sure if there were more kids in the library or not, but I was also way too terrified to go like checking every nook and cranny. And so I sort of ushered the kids to come over to where I was, and we went into an internal spot, like a little room, a copy room essentially. And I hid behind the copy machine, texting my mom to take care of my daughter in case something happened. I was crying. It was very terrifying. And honestly, I don't know how long we sat there, but it felt like a long time. And, from my perspective, at one point we went to a shelter in place where we were. So that crisis seemed to be somewhat avoided, but we did not change from what we were doing. And then they called over the loudspeaker saying that like we would move from whatever period we were in to a later period in the day. My guess is that this is my assumption as like a person who works in safety now, but also just my assumption then. I do believe we were in a lunch period. So that meant there were just like a ton of kids in the lunchroom, which is obviously extremely dangerous. And so they probably just wanted to get them into classrooms where we could lock the door and someone could be in charge of everybody. We could also get an accurate attendance read. So they did move us into X period. Maybe it was 6th period or whatever one is without a lunch. And we all located quickly and quietly to that location, and we did a shelter in place there with the doors locked. And then I did get an email instructing me, and I'm sure all the teachers did, to send in attendance so that they could make sure that we knew where every kid in the school was. What I learned eventually, like we stayed in that shelter in place for a while, and eventually we were like did an early dismissal or something. So it was a very rough day for everyone involved, and my heart breaks for anybody who's been through something like this where lives were lost and way worse things happen, because this is something that's permanently affected me and absolutely no one got hurt. So to my understanding, our security was able to stop this child who did attend our school, and it was a boy, and he had brought in a gun to school. What we didn't know, or the people in the hallway didn't know at the time, was that it was unloaded, but he was advancing towards his locker where he had formerly put ammunition. So it was definitely a situation that, for how it was handled, I'm glad for how it was handled. In retrospect, could there have been better safety things put in place? Absolutely. But I think like that the school did the best with what they had and could at the time. But it definitely did not pique my interest to just continue on being an educator. Yeah. After that, I ended up switching over to like marketing role, and for a variety of reasons. And then, I missed school. So I did some coaching on the side, and, now I'm really working in school safety, which is where my heart and passion is. So.
Yeah. So what I wanted to point out, because we talked the other day, and one of the factors that was apparent to me that was there were a couple of things. First, the manner in which you were notified, and the manner in which you said that you were in this lockdown status, but you weren't getting any information, any updates, any requests for accounting for your kids, any of those things. And then after a period of time, they come over the loudspeaker, and then they physically move everybody from one location, wherever they're at, to another, for essentially, ostensibly, for the accounting for those kids, right? And so there are much better ways to do that, right? And the much more expedient. But it goes to show you that what we do prior to an incident can increase the trauma experience during that incident. And not knowing the situation, and in an incident where there's an actual activity, whether it's like in your case where you have a threat of a gun, you find the person with the gun, and then you start doing your investigation, and you find out that there was ammunition in the locker, and he was probably headed towards that. That takes a lot of time, right? And so you're a short period of time for that type of incident is like an hour and a half, right? And then they have no idea what's going on, and then all of a sudden, let's move from here to there, and we don't know what they're getting to.
What we didn't know at the time, or at least I know that I didn't, but what we didn't know at the time was that the person who had done this was already stopped and off campus. But there's a lot of reasons why, I guess, it didn't happen, whether it's availability of being able to communicate or they're trying to like figure things out beforehand. But, to moving from one location to another was very, very nerve wracking for me. And based on the utter silence was nerve wracking, I'd say, for everyone.
Yeah. All of that creates.
But again, you're right. I mean, there's a lot of ways to communicate. And I think also a lot of times you can have systems in place that you think are going to work well, right? I actually remember prior to that incident, we had really been working on making sure, our lockdown procedures were as tight as possible. We had one of our workshops, teacher workshops on like a Saturday. We had like a former FBI agent come into the school and tell us all these things. And we had amped up our preparedness, so we thought. And one of the things about communicating, right, was if you're practicing when kids are in your class, we had these cards and you could slide like a green card under the door into the hallway to say that like everyone is accounted for, or like a red card saying like I have, essentially indicating like I have kids. I think there are issues with that because I get it. Maybe not everybody has the electronic communication available. However, by putting a green card out under the door, not only are you communicating with the people you're intending to communicate, but you're also communicating with everybody, any assailant, to let them know like this room is filled with kids. And especially if this is like a former sophomore or a student.
Nowadays, that's really not considered best practice for that very reason, right? But
and this is like 8 years ago.
Yeah. So it's not really considered best practice anymore to do that for that very reason. But it also shows that if we're not fully aware of what happens throughout the entire timeline of an event and we're not communicating with our people, then it causes anxiety. Anxiety causes varying levels of trauma based upon the length, the type of incident that you're involved in and all these psychological issues. But just being able, we've talked about this before on the podcast where it's important to tell people two things: what is happening and what you want them to do. And oftentimes we stop short of what is happening. We stop short of lockdown and make the assumption that everyone understands what that means. But there's so many different circumstances in which a lockdown can occur. People are like, what's going on? Without any information, most people jump to worst case scenario, which is better than starting at the beginning, right? The lowest level. Yeah. But the sooner we get information to people, especially we're in lockdown, and then at some point the suspect is in custody, the kid is in custody, we're safe now. So just putting out a thing that says, hey, we're trying to figure this out. We have the person detained, and just being able to send that message out to people, whether that's on a PA system, an email system, through digital signage, or through an app like what Crisis Go provides, but just being able to communicate, hey, we're stabilized and you're no longer in danger. Hold tight, account for your kids, the ones you have with you right now, account for them, and then we can figure that out from there.
Yeah, and
it reduces that.
Yeah, and I will say in this particular incident, this school's defense, in our trainings prior, we had been let know that if we're ever in a true lockdown situation, if we move to shelter in place, anytime we go from lockdown to shelter in place, that whatever the true crisis situation has been averted, but we're now in like a maintenance or like recovery phase. And if we go into lockdown, then potentially there's another threat. I will give them that. But like all the kids aren't in on those trainings, all the substitute teachers are not in on those trainings. A random 19-year-old, student teacher, is not in on those trainings. So I agree with you. I feel like there are much better is a strong word, much more efficient ways to communicate as each passing year goes by.
Yeah.
More and more comes out, more and more options become available. And also, unfortunately, we have had, more incidences. And in those incidences, we do learn like, hey, maybe putting green cards out in front of your classroom is not the smartest thing to do. Or, I know that
Yeah.
there's just like been a number of different like procedures that, sometimes we think are a good idea and then, later we don't. Like for me, that this one might be slightly controversial, but I'm not the biggest fan of the barricades. I know right now that that's like considered best practices to barricade the doors. For me, it takes too much time. And I fear that as time goes on, it's going to be one of those things that like hasn't proved to be. This is me speculating, but I think it might be one of those things that's like goes to the wayside, similar to the green cards. I feel like one issue is that it alerts someone that definitely kids are in that room because it takes a number of people to barricade. If you go across, most states, it's illegal to have just a blank door. It has to have some sort of window, right? So if you could see that there's 20 desks piled up, that there are people in that room. It's loud as well. So, I mean, it's, to move 20 desks is loud. And so I
Yeah.
feel like it could be something that ends up actually identifying where people are. That's my fear with it. I do get if you have nothing else, this is your best case scenario. And the first 45 seconds are going to be loud. And if that's my only line of defense, I'd probably do it too. But I don't love it because it is loud.
Yeah.
And as you know,
So
as anybody in school safety knows, the first 3 minutes is the most crucial because that's the national average for response time from law enforcement. And usually barring like those not little, but those specific outliers, usually once the law enforcement gets there, they're able to shut things down very quickly, apprehend that person or stop that person. And so for me, the first 3 minutes is when you need to appear like you're not there and be as
yeah.
quiet as possible. But I also
Yeah.
it's a 50-50 split for me. I get why
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
are
Yeah.
states,
I'm
but
I'm going to push back a little bit, but only
well,
because what the ultimate goal is when we're locking doors and we're getting into the corners, the blind side of things, so that
yep,
as I love you guys says, locks lights out of sight, right? But
yep,
what we're really trying to do, establish a barrier
mhm,
that takes time to get through. And so, because every second that somebody has to struggle to get through a door or whatever,
limits casual. Yeah,
it gives you exactly that much more time for somebody else to come help you, right? The other issue is
I agree.
that when we're looking at, especially the vast majority of the schools, the statistics are pretty clear. There has been zero people that have breached a locked, hardened door. And that might have changed. That stat's a little bit old, but there have been people who have gone through windows and stuff, but going through a door is pretty safe and significant.
Yeah.
So
That is
when
that I was just
yeah
gonna say that's
and
something that I had not been, aware of, but I think that's amazing to hear. You know what I mean? Like
yeah,
I, I'm not saying like, oh, 100% we should never barricade.
yeah,
For me, it's a least ideal scenario, but I do completely understand the idea of
yeah,
trying to limit
yeah,
the casualties, limit the amount of time that the person has available to them to kind of run through the school before
mhm,
someone hopefully is able to stop them.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. I was
yeah,
going to say also,
yeah,
like with,
yeah. I get it.
oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no,
It
I
is
get it.
lagging a little bit
It
on Kelly's end. That's why you guys
yeah,
are.
my computer's not
It's
top
like
notch.
delayed a little bit. So I think
It,
that you're not saying something. So
Yeah,
then I start saying something.
yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah. But the reality is first of all, I'm going to say that I am almost never 100%. This is the way you have to do it.
yeah. Right.
Circumstances in the environment dictate what your response or what your actions are, and so there's a lot of methodologies that I'm not a huge fan of, right? But under certain circumstances, that's all you got. So let's move through that. But in order, when we're talking about creating time barriers and providing the ability to survive as long as it takes for somebody to get to you to help you, whatever that means, right? Whether
Yeah.
it's isolating and neutralizing the threat, or because that creates time, right? And or locking the door, barricading the door, and or having distraction items. I know we talked about that a little bit before as well. But just having those time delays help that survival rate, right? But
Yeah.
most people don't have a hardened safety zone, a
Yes.
shelter, right? And
Yeah. And
so
even
that's
if
what we're talking about.
yeah, like, so as a teacher, I mean, what we were always told is that the corner you put your kids in, and I've worked in a couple different schools, so the corner that you put your kids in is one that is supposed to be out of sight from both the window and the door. And
Mhm.
typically you're going from the door, and but as many educators have told me, and then also my own personal experience, is that usually you have one wall that is all windows and there is no spot. There's no spot that you can't see. Now, some people have a unique classroom that maybe has like an L shape or even has a closet or a bathroom. And so obviously almost every scenario, if you have a bathroom, like that's where you should probably put your kids, right? Or if you have a closet or like sometimes, especially in high schools, they'll have like science labs that join with like a teacher, like I don't even know how you would call it, but like it's almost like an internal classroom that two classrooms that could go in and the doors lock. Those are like good
Mhm.
options because we're talking no windows and we're talking, if he has a window, it'd be like one, but hopefully none, right? Those are good
Mhm.
spots. But reality is there in most classrooms there isn't really any, what you would call like a hard corner there, like there's something
Yep.
that's totally out of sight, which is why I do love the shelters, because essentially the exact same spot in your classroom where you would take your kids to kind of hide and like a kind of like huddle in a corner, you could just
Mhm.
open a door. It's less traumatic as a whole, right? You open a door and your classroom goes inside, shuts the door. We wait, hopefully it's just a drill, we wait through the 3 minutes of the drill, and then everybody returns to their seats.
Mhm.
In our case, like we've done tests to see, very similar to like a fire drill, like how long does it take to get your whole class in? And so what we advise is the teacher immediately locks the outside door, like the door to the hallway, and then, opens the shelter door. And then, the kids file in, shut the door, and it locks internally. And what
Yeah.
we've seen is it takes about 35 seconds for
Yeah.
35
So
to 45 seconds for everybody to get in. So,
yeah.
yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the configuration of those shelters that you're talking about, because there is a big difference. And this is some. Let me first describe some of the ones I have issues with. Right. There was a company that approached me at some conference and said we're gonna harden the cafeteria, and I forget what the price was, but irrelevant here for this discussion. But we're going to harden
Mhm.
the entire cafeteria, and that's going to be the safe room. So when something happens and you order a lockdown, you want everyone to evacuate the entire school into the cafeteria, and immediately you start. And what, from my perspective, from somebody who has a little bit of knowledge here, I don't know how somebody could think that's actually a good idea,
Very bad.
is that you take everyone out of from one side of the school and you evacuate them all the way to the other side to get them into the shelter, and the first bad assumption is that your shooter's not in that cafeteria, right? So what happens if that's the case? And Columbine was an example of, not, I think it was a library, not necessarily the cafeteria, maybe it was, I forget all of the circumstances. But the idea of having only one solution is an issue. Having something that you have to deploy, like you said, takes time, takes expertise.
It
It
is.
it
There are so many issues with the deployment. Yeah.
yeah. So and when you talk about saving space, that space has to remain available.
And you
And
know,
right, and in school classrooms, it's never available. You have a desk there. Something's got to move, right? So when you approached me, this was, and this really is the I'm going to say the only reason I said, okay, we can talk about this, is because when you experience a situation like you did, where you have no shelter,
yeah,
you have no definitive hardened place, that becomes an issue. Now, the vast majority of us will deal with whatever it is we have available to us. And Ethan and I are very pro, let's take some actions beforehand. Let's be proactive, right? Beforehand and before something happens. And this is something that you can do beforehand that assists with that point, what we call that point of failure, right? When all your other efforts have failed, then now you have somebody walking down your hallway
yeah,
with a gun.
You're
So
100% right. And I do really appreciate you guys taking the time to do the podcast because this, in my opinion, is an answer to some of those like failure points. And we do always say, Dennis, who owns the company, he always says that this is a solution that is a part of the whole effort, right? We're talking about you do need to continue to do all your front end work. So, things that deter people from ever being able to get into your building. There are a lot of things you can do. I mean, you can have greeters, you can have an SRO, you can have a hardened vestibule, which is a lot of schools have these. It's not something we provide, but it's something that we advocate for definitely, which is that, that glass space or it's usually like a fortified bullet resistant glass where it's like you're in an awning essentially, and you need to be buzzed into that awning, and then you need to be buzzed into the school. All of these measures, when we talk about the bullet resistant glass on classroom wall, classroom windows, we talk about a much cheaper solution, which I spoke to you about before, which is like those films where students can see out, but outsiders can't, tinted films. There are a lot of, front end measures you can take to kind of protect your perimeter, but you do sort of have to acknowledge, similar to what with you guys do and what we do, is that if, God forbid, someone does breach the school, what are you going to do? You need to have communication tools. You need to have a hard and fast location for people to, get themselves safe. And to your point, having that location be one spot is a nightmare of an idea, because having students pour into the hallways, because it's more than just, is the shooter in the caf? They could be anywhere in the building. And to take them from a proximate shelter of a closed locked door into mayhem of a hallway, even if it was a false alarm. And we know that there are false alarms every day. There are what was the stat we talked about the other day? 6+ guns are taken out of seized, whether they're loaded or functional, who knows? But over 6 guns a day are seized from schools where a crisis did not occur. Someone avoided the crisis. I'm sure in those situations, maybe 1, 2, or 3 out of those 6, you actually went into a lockdown. You actually triggered the emergency procedures. Imagine if this is a crisis that was averted, but yet you have kids running to the cafeteria. Maybe it's kindergartner gets trampled. You know what I mean?
Say, imagine all the kids getting run over.
Yeah. And that would happen. I mean, we saw, like, I'm dating myself here, but we saw in the late 90s, early 2000s, people trampled to death trying to get a Tickle Me Elmo. So if that's what human nature and human instinct is like when we're talking about something as trivial as a toy, what is it going to be like when we're talking about as important as life or death, or perceived to be life or death situation? So I agree with you. I feel like when we're talking about, I always advocate for hardening our cafeterias, but that is specifically because for the students who are already in the cafeteria. And even in that situation, anytime I talk to a school, I actually always recommend that they get 2 shelters with 2 doors each. So you can have a very clear procedure, and you have the least amount of people funneling into one spot at a time. And the procedure that I always recommend is you put a piece of tape down the cafeteria floor. If you're on this side of the tape, you go to this shelter. On this side of the tape, you go to that shelter. And I always say, please put 2 doors on. Some schools want more than 2 doors, but which we can do. But from a safety perspective, in my mind, 2 doors is great, because if there's 30 people, 40 people going to that shelter, it's only 25 people are standing in a line for, 10, 15 seconds to get in the door. And then we can still have our same 45-second, everybody is in shelter, versus one door where maybe 100 kids or 50 kids are all trying to funnel into one door. That can delay. So I always recommend 2 doors. Sometimes people say, okay, well, we want 4 doors. That's 4 doors to lock. So we want all the doors shut and locked as fast as possible. And I haven't come to a spot yet where I thought, oh, we do need more than 2 doors, but it's not impossible, maybe a very large space. But yeah, for me, I always say, hey, yeah, your cafeteria needs to be protected. And the idea of making your cafeteria essentially a shelter is very smart, but only for the kids who are already there, because pouring them into the hallway.
Right. Yeah. So it's just you have to treat it like a big classroom. You got 200 kids that you have to deal with. So deal with those 200 kids. Don't say, okay, this is our only shelter. But the other unique thing is, the other unique thing that you mentioned was that your shelters are rated for tornadoes. So
They are.
that that increases the utility of those specific spaces.
Yeah.
So
I can speak to that
yeah,
a little bit. So
yeah,
essentially, a lot of schools out in the Midwest who, they deal with tornadoes and this is a very real risk for them, they use our shelters. And so our shelters are modular, right? And so there's a essentially they're pieces, right? And so we can build them as big or as little as the space needs. Typically, what schools will do is they will look at the capacity of a room versus how many kids are typically in that spot, and they'll make a decision. Do I make it off of, okay, we always have 14 kids in this, all of our classrooms, our max is 16 kids. And so we're going to make it for 16. Or the capacity has, of the room is 22. We're going to make it for 22, whatever. And one good thing about it being modular is that if you do build for your current status and that actually ends up going to capacity, you could always order 3 more steel walls. It's modular, so somebody else can come in. For the tornado aspect of it, essentially it's bolted into the ground. And so it's EF5 tornado rated. And as long as it is on the first floor. So when you have a lot of schools out in like Tornado Alley will only be 1 floor anyway because of the risk of tornadoes. But essentially, anything on the second floor it's just legally not tornado rated because it's the second floor.
Hmm.
But most of the schools end up with only 1 floor out there. But anyway, so we will bolt it into the ground, and that bolting it into the wall and the ground is part of what makes it tornado rated. So it's a very safe structure. And honestly, the quickness of getting the kids in there, a lot of schools have exactly what you're talking about, a safe room or like a tornado safe room. A similar problem exists when there's only one, right? It takes time. Any educator knows this. If you had to relocate because you're going to have, a speaker in the auditorium and every kid's going to filter into that auditorium, every single teacher knows that for one, they don't release all the classes at the same time because it would be mayhem. Somebody would be like trampled. They'll release 100 wing or 200 wing, you're all going to go now, or it takes time to get from place to place. And sometimes, particularly, with severe weather, time is not a luxury. There might be like a very sudden, there's a tornado whipping through here. We need to get our kids into these shelters. So that's one of the reasons why we are pretty popular in the Midwest. Yeah.
yeah. So awesome. So yeah, shelters are good. They're, the drawback, obviously, and we've talked a little bit about this. The drawback is cost. It's an investment, but it is an investment, right? And it's one of those things that it depends on what your
Priorities.
commitment is. Yeah, your priorities are, right? And when we're talking about providing the best we can for our kids, this is a consideration. I think you said it takes up 5% of typically about 5% of the classroom space, and it's relatively non-invasive in the classroom. And teachers, being teachers, they decorate them and they do those things to them. So it's something that's certainly should be considered, right? And it's one of those things that you have to plan for, you have to train for, because there are some considerations, right? Putting 30 kids into a box at one time can be a challenge. But those are challenges that, especially when you're talking about, you lock the room door, and now you're in a ballistic rated shelter that sits there ready to go. It's already deployed. All you have to do is get in it. And then that's something that probably more of us should consider, because unfortunately, from my perspective, a lot of our schools are still in this sort of, I'll call it panic button mode, and they wait for something to happen, and they've been fed this information that says, hey, all you need is this panic button, and you just press this panic button, help will come. Literally the tagline for one of our competitors: press the button, help will come. And the idea is not having a button to press. The idea is that you never have to press that button, and you should have all of these measures in place ahead of time to do everything that you can to prevent that button from ever being pushed.
Yeah.
but understanding that you can't prevent everything from occurring. You could have all of the best systems, all of the best things in place, systems, measures, training, and something is going to fall through the cracks. There's some scenario that you just didn't think of or consider, and all of a sudden that's your worst case scenario. So now you need a button. Now you need a shelter. Now you need all of this stuff. And if you don't have those things available to you, they're no good to you because they're not available. You can't consider them. So
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And back to what you're saying before about the space, right? Yeah, and money and space. So those are usually the money is down to priorities, it's in availability. So there are referendums, millages, obviously people can go through school budgets and request. You could do like a tiered approach and say, hey, we're pretty satisfied with, we have bullet resistant glass in our doors and we're pretty satisfied with our locking at the moment, but we do have some unsecured, vulnerable spots in our school, like auditorium, cafeteria, a library, a shared reading space or something that is more vulnerable. And we could do some sort of tiered approach to say, hey, we're going to protect these, sitting duck type situations in the school. And maybe we can tier later do the classrooms. We'll see. And I have a feeling that, once you get something like this into the school district, the community ends up saying, hey, my kid feels very safe in the library. I feel safe with my kid in the library now, but I'm a little worried about math class. And so, eventually the community will ask for these things. And when the community asks, that's when you are able to pass, a referendum or an increase in the school budget. But there are other things because sometimes, that's not an option. So there's the COPS grant. They have some specific grants for violence prevention. Local colleges, like that is something that I'm seeing a lot. The colleges are taking out grants to protect their local K to 12. I have seen this over and over again in my research of who's winning the COPS grant. And I'm seeing a lot of colleges have like this initiative to protect not necessarily their school, but their local K to 12s. So that's something, an avenue. And then there's, traditional financing, there's leasing, there's all these things, but you are right. The finance is definitely a hang up for anyone who's advocating for school shelters. And honestly, or any sort, as we know, like sometimes it could be something as simple as a single metal detector at the front door. And people are advocating for this. And someone says, no, X, I'm not paying for X amount of dollars. And to that, I always say to someone who's looking to advocate is that you need to press the people in charge about their priorities. Go look up how much it costs at your school to put in the football stadium, because usually it's $2 to $20 million. So,
it's
and
a lot.
Yeah, I like that's any parent that says to me, oh, I have no idea how, or even, somebody who is, head of the PTA. They're like, I really want to bring this up at the school board, but nobody will listen to me because they say we don't have money. And I just, I always say that look up how
we had that football stadium. I always talk about the district that I worked for. They spent about $50,000 a week per football game.
That's wild. That's a teacher salary for the year.
Right. And I had $45,000 for the entire district for a single year for my security budget. And we just put in fact, it wasn't, I don't even think it was completed when I left, but they just put in a brand new stadium at their marquee school, the flagship high school. And it was $40 million. Yeah. 40.
What? I've never encountered that high. I've encountered up to 20, but 40 is what, like these. And, that's definitely a scenario where, the funds are somewhere and you need to talk to the right person. And then there are situations where it's the opposite. The school barely has any funds and their priorities are schools, school safety is their priority, and they are out there looking for grants. They're out there compelling their community, and they make it happen. So it's like, wouldn't you rather be the line?
And there's public-private partnerships. There's local nonprofit grants. There is ways to get it done if you want to.
Yes.
Yeah.
And especially when there are certain, obviously private institutions often have endowment funds. There are a lot of places to look, there's also fundraisers that can be done. There are some solutions there if someone regardless if you're talking about the shelter or if you're talking about any safety solution, there I always say this to parents because like a lot of times parents or a staff member will talk to me and say, I really, really wish we had this, but, I don't have influence or power over the money. And I always encourage people to actually see how much power they do have. And a loud voice at a board meeting is still a loud voice at a board meeting. So whatever your solution is, I always suggest people look for the money because it's it can be found or it can be done strategically where you don't need quite as much. I know you're talking about the space as well. The 5% in my mind, like as a former teacher, if somebody said to me, "I'm going to eliminate 5% of your classroom space," I might be a little hesitant. But then when I first saw what they look like. 5% is less than it sounds like. It's up against a wall. It's very similar because I had this happen in my classroom one year. No one asked me because it was not something that seemed like you would ask anyone about this. They installed along like almost half of a wall, like these essentially cabinets, floor to almost ceiling, full like cabinet wall. And that is a lot like what this is. It comes out, our smaller versions can be like the one wide panel, and then they're usually by like 3 or 4 of our smaller panels. That really doesn't take up a lot of room. It's only a few feet wide. And the reason being is this is not designed for luxuriating. It's not designed for hanging out in there. It's the exact same space you would think of if you were huddling your kids in the corner, but you're just doing it behind an actual fortified wall. And what we've seen is kids and teachers calling to thank us and say, hey, like we feel really safe. We've seen a number of school districts say our enrollment has increased because people want to go to school here. They want to send here. And I definitely can attest to that. If our neighborhood school or next town over got them, I'd move. My kids would be there.
That's a good point to bring out because I feel like that's something that schools are experiencing for a number of reasons is a huge exodus of kids from schools. They're pursuing other avenues.
A lot. So I don't know what the numbers are, so I can't speak to the stats, but I will say I personally know people. And then also just in things that I've read, there are a number of people leaving for fear of things like this. And then also other reasons, right? They maybe are unhappy with the curriculum or XYZ. A lot of people leaving to go homeschool their kids. And I taught in person, right? And I do believe there's value to in-person school for social skills, emotional well-being, all these things. But it is very nerve-wracking to not know if your kid is going to come home. So I do understand a parent's choice to make that switch. There's also truancy issues that come from the traumas and the fears of how things are communicated during incidences or near incidences, like we were talking about with the something as simple as barricading the doors. That's, for many kids, they'll be just fine. They'll barricade them during drills and things will be just fine. But there are going to be a number of kids that that's like doesn't feel comfortable. And it's a little too real. And so, truancy, it becomes an issue. And definitely when you're talking about like, hey, we have a real solution versus, you look at your teacher's eyes and you kind of know that she also isn't sure, versus like, hey, you get in there and you tell the kids like, for sure you're safe behind these walls. That is much, it's just much more of a less anxiety provoking experience.
Yeah, fear, anxiety, and the results of fear and anxiety is contagious, right?
Yeah.
So we see it in the animal kingdom all of the time. If you walk through a herd of animals and everyone's just looking, and then all of a sudden one spooks, the entire herd spooks, right? And so
they press their pants on. One best press the pants.
Right. No kidding, right? But that's part of it, right? Is if we communicate fear and anxiety, the kids are very perceptive. They're going to pick up on that. If the school staff is not confident in what is happening and they're fearful or they're questioning what's happening and doing things, and you can see their anxiety start to increase, that does not help the situation, right? And part of that is just being super confident and, hey, we're going to be okay. I know what to do. We're going to go back here. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. And we're going to survive this as opposed to the other narrative is, I don't know what's happening. I hope we survive this. I hope we do this. I don't know what to do. Nobody's talking to me, blah, blah, blah. Then,
Yeah.
then
I feel like the
we take,
communication, the communication tool that you guys have, like what is Echo? I don't want to say the wrong word.
yeah, it's the Echo badge, it's the panic button, but we have an app that is that communication piece.
Yeah. So it's like when you have multiple features of a front end and back end safety solutions, right? You've got all the things
Mhm.
at the front end, but yet somebody did get in, right? And if a teacher who isn't even on, who isn't even in the classroom, she's just walking from the teacher's lounge to a bathroom, sees someone in the school, maybe they didn't see her, maybe they did say her, but like it sees someone in the school, boom, you hit the button. Now we're immediately going into lockdown. We're talking about a second to get the information, as opposed to someone have to go and find a phone or run somewhere or go into a classroom if they were in the hallway to hit I want to say loudspeaker, but at the receiving port of the loudspeaker. But whatever it is, like you're talking about a second versus seconds. These are all really important things. And then once everybody's in a lockdown, you get everybody in a shelter. We're talking about 35 seconds to do so. And if you are missing kids or you have all your kids and you want to cut down the time that someone might be looking for kids, you can use the app and explain, I have all my kids and we're locked down. The doors are shut. God forbid there's some issue where someone can't lock their classroom door. Like there's a sub that day and they picked up the wrong key. They thought they had a universal key, but it's actually the key to the gym and they can't lock their door. Like these are things that you cut down on all of the time of saying, okay, let's check with everybody somehow versus we have this communication. We know there's one issue and we can fix that. We can address and fix that one issue, or at least advise that person what to do, And in that situation, which I know as a teacher, nothing against substitutes, but like they're wonderful and we need them, but they aren't in the building every single day. They don't have the same trainings that the teachers have. Many of them are retired teachers. And so, they taught 30 years ago and they may not pick up the right key. They may forget to pick up a key at all. They may not know that one door is a little funny and you actually have to pull the handle up a little bit to actually get the key to work. There's always an issue with this, a new person in that room who has not received the training or may not have the right tools, or they may not even think to lock the door at all. Like my daughter, I will not mention the school because we're live on the internet and the school is great. But my daughter said that they have the magnets, which are great in some ways, also not necessarily great in other ways, because again, if you don't know they're there and you're a substitute teacher and you hear lockdown and you go and lock the door, if you don't know that there's a magnet there to pull, you are in trouble. And so there was a lockdown situation, no major crisis. They thought there was potential for a crisis, so they locked the school down very smartly. And then the police did a walkthrough of the school to make sure everything was okay, which it was. And everything was perfect except for one door. And that was the one my kid was in. It was a substitute teacher who had locked the door. They're all huddled in the back. And my daughter told me her heart skipped a beat when the police officer literally just opened the door, like because it was locked.
Man.
But it was not locked because the magnetic tab was not pulled. So there's a lot of issues. Things can always go wrong. And that's why you have to have as many things in place as possible, because in that scenario, if you lock the door, if you think you lock the door and then you put all your kids in the shelter and and the shelter door is very intuitive. There's no magnets possible. It is like, it's like a vault. You know what I mean? Like you lock the door, steel deadbolts, plural, go across. There's no, opportunity. But let's say you do have those magnets because that's something your school put in, 10 years ago. When someone accidentally didn't secure that lock properly, you have another fail safe. And that's what I always advocate for, as many fail safes as possible and as much communication as possible.
Yep. All right. We're getting up to the top of that hour. So appreciate you. I appreciate your perspective. Love the passion towards school safety.
Oh yeah.
And I love the idea of shelters that are there, deployed, ready to go. It certainly provides that added layer of security and protection. And maybe just, the idea that I'm safer, right? That feeling of being safer. So appreciate you and all you're doing. So thanks for joining us, and we should talk in the future.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. And if you have any questions about what we discussed, leave a comment on our website at crisisgo.com. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time on Coffee with Kelly, a discussion on school safety.